All right, here in our second lecture for chapter 20 and 21, we're going to talk a little bit more about lymph nodes and the lymphoid cells. Those are the cells that are hanging out in your lymph nodes, and we'll talk about what some of their jobs are. You've heard about these a little bit before when we were studying the white blood cells back at the beginning of Unit 2. All right, so these main lymphoid cells are lymphocytes. So those are types of white blood cells that we learned about back in Unit 2. So they arise out of the bone marrow. That's where they're initially made. And yes, they do travel through the blood, but many of them are actually stationed within lymph nodes and secondary organs that we'll talk about of the lymphatic system, because those are great places for them to be stationed. Their jobs are going to be to intercept, detect microbes and other foreign substances that have invaded your body and generate responses to them. They're going to generate sets of weaponry that can be used to eliminate those types of things from the body. So the two main types of those cells are your T cells. Those are also called T lymphocytes, and the B cells. Those are also called B lymphocytes. And we'll talk more about their specific jobs in helping you fight foreign invaders in the body when we get to chapter 21. Okay, the lymph nodes are little swollen, tiny organs. They're the main or the primary lymphoid organs of the body. And again, in an adult, you got about 500 or 600 of these scattered in different locations in the body. And they're in clusters or groups that are named for the areas where they're located. I'll show you some of these on visible body shortly. So you have them in the inguinal region, that's your groin, lower pelvis area, axillary, around the armpit, cervical, those are your neck, lymph nodes, etc. You have some in the popliteal area on the back of the knees. You also have some in a cluster on the anterior side of the elbow. Then you also have some that are deeper. So in the abdominopelvic cavity, you have lots of lymph nodes that receive and filter lymph draining off of your major organs. These lymph nodes are embedded generally within connective tissue, and they're in clusters, of course, connected to those lymphatic vessels. Now, if you look inside a lymph node, if you cut it open and you magnified it very heavily, this is an image that's been generated with a type of microscope called a scanning electron microscope that uses beams of electrons to generate really super highly magnified images, and then they're colorized to give you all these cool pictures. But what you would see inside a heavily magnified lymph node are, you will see lots of macrophages. There's one of those. Those are phagocytic cells that are kind of like the vacuum cleaners of your body. And then scattered around, like right in there, that bumpy cell there, there's one over here, there's a couple of them over here. Those are lymphocytes. And you're going to have B and T lymphocytes that have different jobs, and many of those are going to be stationed in your lymph nodes. Now, all the other stuff that you see here, the branching type structures, those are reticular fibers. So if you dig deep back into Biology 201, when you study tissues, reticular fibers are related to collagen fibers. You have those in reticular type connective tissues, and reticular means webby. So you can kind of see in there, if you look closely at all those branching structures, that's basically forming a protein meshwork, which makes up the or occupies a lot of the volume inside of a lymph node and provides it with a framework for all these other cells in there to hang out on. The reticular cells you see here, those are kind of like fibroblasts, if you remember those from your connective tissues. Those are going to be the cells that are living inside the lymph nodes and are responsible for producing, making these reticular fibers, that framework that you have inside there. Okay, and again, here's a more blown up view of this diagram from your textbook, which is showing us where you have clusters of lymph nodes. And for the most part, that, along with some basic structure of a lymph node, a couple of internal features, which we'll take a look at shortly, that's really all the anatomy you have for the lymphatic system. So you have lymph nodes that are in the neck area. You have a bunch of those. Those are your cervical lymph nodes. You guys know that because they swell when you have an infection. Like if you have a sore throat, it's not unusual for cervical lymph nodes or one or both sides of your neck to be swelling. And what's happening is those lymphocytes that are stationed in those lymph nodes are detecting whatever it is that's causing your sore throat, bacteria, virus, or whatever, and they're beginning to respond. When they respond, they divide over and over again inside those lymph nodes, and that makes your lymph nodes swell. Then you have axillary lymph nodes and clusters around the armpits. Inguinal lymph nodes are down in the pelvis. And I'll bring up visible body shortly so we can see some of those things on there as well. You do have a lot of lymph nodes in your abdominopelvic cavity because those are draining lymph from those organs, and also the intestinal tract, like we were talking about. You have those lacteals, which are specialized lymphatic vessels that collect fats that you have absorbed from your diet. Those are located down in that area as well. There's the cisterna chyli, which is a swollen area that is collecting fluid that's draining up this way from lower parts of the body. And then that leads to the thoracic duct, which passes this way and then empties into the left subclavian vein, right where it intersects with the left internal jugular vein. And then over on the right-hand side, as we talked about before, all of the areas that you see shaded in green there, the lymph that is draining off of those tissues encounters lymph nodes, eventually makes its way into the right lymphatic duct, which is just a little short stump right there that is going to empty into the right subclavian vein, right where it joins the right internal jugular vein. And you do have clusters of lymph nodes, like I was telling you guys, on the front side of your elbow, the anterior side of the elbow. You've got some of those there as well. And keep in mind when you're looking at that diagram, all the tissues you see shaded in green, the lymph eventually enters that right lymphatic duct. And everything you see shaded in red, the majority of the body, all of the lymph draining from those tissues, eventually makes its way into the thoracic duct and gets emptied back into the, that might only be in there for a short period of time if it's really close to the subclavian vein, but it is going to empty into that thoracic duct and then finally get dumped over into the left subclavian vein. All right, functions of lymph nodes. What are lymph nodes doing? They're filtering the lymph. So we just saw how you've got macrophages stationed inside there, and macrophages do phagocytosis, which we'll look at in a little bit more detail when we cover the immune system. Basically, they bind foreign substances and internalize them and digest them and destroy them. So it's great that we have macrophages stationed in our lymph nodes because, as I was pointing out on the first video lecture, since your lymphatic capillaries are collecting tissue fluids, if you have an infection in a particular tissue, some bacteria, some yeast, some viruses, whatever it may be that's present in those tissues will wind up draining into those lymphatic vessels as well. And those are eventually going to make their way to these lymph nodes where you have all these cells of your immune system stationed and concentrated inside that webby network there. And it makes it more likely that they're going to actually intercept foreign invaders that have entered the body. Immunity. So your lymphocytes are the B and the T cells. Your B and your T lymphocytes are the two main warriors of the more powerful branch of your immune system that we'll be talking about. And it's the one that actually gives you immunity, where like if you you've been infected with some particular virus before, you're not likely to get it again because your immune system remembers that you've been infected with it and is able to generate weaponry much faster the next time. That's how immunity actually develops to microorganisms and other things that are foreign to the body. The lymph, the fluid, has a certain way that it flows through the lymph nodes. Lymph nodes have multiple lymphatic vessels attached to them that are bringing fluid in. Those are called afferent lymphatic vessels. You know, afferent, you've seen that word before in anatomy and physiology. That means incoming. So you have those, and the fluid then percolates through the medullary sinuses. And you've heard sinus before as a compartment, like the sinuses you have in your in the bones of the face and skull. And then your filtered fluid exits through efferent vessels. So efferent means outgoing, which you guys have heard before, or if you've seen that used before in anatomy and physiology. Okay, so here is a typical lymph node that has been cut open in a cross section. So you can see, right, oops. Right there, right there, right there, right there, and right there. Those are several afferent lymphatic vessels that are bringing fluid into the lymph node. My dachshunds just went wild there for a second. They're not barking, but they think they hear something. If there was something actually out there, they'd run back over to me very quickly. They're not as tough as they think they are. Okay, so then then the fluid winds up entering these medullary sinuses. So medullary refers to medulla. So just like you've heard with other organs before, lymph nodes have a cortex, which is the outer area, like the cortex of the adrenal glands. And then they have a medulla, which is a central area inside the lymph nodes. So the medullary sinuses are these internal compartments. The areas that you see in pink scattered around in there, those are fluid-filled spaces where you have all those reticular webby fibers. And so your fluid is percolating through there. In purple, what you're seeing are called medullary cords. And you have lots of lymphocytes stationed in those areas. And then you also have other little purple clusters out here in the cortex as well. These lymphoid follicles, those are also places where you have lymphocytes stationed and poised there, ready to respond to things that are foreign to the body that are entering these lymph nodes. And if they do respond, they're going to multiply. That sets off a chain reaction where they start to multiply and increase in numbers, and that's why you feel your lymph nodes swelling. All right, I'm going to bring up visible body, and we're going to take a quick look at a 3D view of the body so you can see some of the groups and clusters of lymph nodes and where they're scattered throughout the body. All right, let's just take a look at a few of these features here on visible body. So we have a body up here that we're taking a look at. And let me zoom in up here on the neck. So a few of the lymph node groupings that you need to be able to recognize, they're named according to the body regions where these lymph nodes are located. So like right here over on the right-hand side, those are some of the cervical lymph nodes. You have some of them over here as well. And yes, if you're using something like visible body, it's going to divide these cervical lymph nodes up into anterior and posterior groups and superficial groups and so forth. And don't worry about that. Just know the lymph nodes that are in the neck region on the left and the right side are cervical lymph nodes. All right, and then of course you have your axillary lymph nodes. So if we dissect off some of our muscles here, and we zoom in here down into the axillary region, lymph nodes that are located here in the axillary region are called the axillary lymph nodes. And so you've got several of them. And when I highlight some of the lymphatic, some of the lymphatic vessels you see there, visible body is letting you know these are anterior, axillary, or pectoral lymph vessels. So those are going to lead to axillary lymph nodes that drain the fluid that is passing through those vessels. So those are going to be collecting lymph that is draining off of the muscle and skin and other tissues of the pectoral region, the chest region. So you have those lymph nodes on the left and the right side. You do have some cubital lymph nodes, so you guys should be aware of those. Those are on the anterior side of the elbow. If you guys remember, cubital refers to your elbow region. So that's not too hard to remember. Got those on the left and the right side. And let's see, we're going to have to come down here, go down into the inguinal region. So down here in the pelvis, you've got superficial and deeper inguinal lymph nodes scattered around. Oops, I just didn't mean to select that one. Several different tracts or groupings that are kind of in a line of these lymph nodes. Just know that your lymph nodes that are located down in the groin, lower pelvis area are called inguinal lymph nodes. That's not too hard to remember if you remember your inguinal body region terminology. And of course, you've got lots of lymphatic vessels, which are hard for me to highlight because they're so thin, but they're draining fluid off of the tissues of the legs. And down in the legs, you do have, over on the back side of the knee, we'll kind of zoom in there, you have some popliteal lymph nodes. You can say that popliteal or popliteal. Those are two different pronunciations for it. I think popliteal is more British. And of course, here in Alabama, we're going to say popliteal. That's probably the way we would say your popliteal lymph nodes. So that's where those are located. Now let's go back up here to the I never can get these arrows straight on visible body. I always want to click the up arrow and the down arrow, and for some reason they just do the opposite of what I want them to do. I use this so much I need to contact them and put in my demands about how their navigation should work here. All right, let's do some dissection here and go into the abdominopelvic cavity. There we go. Okay, so if you guys remember the cisterna chyli I was talking about, there's where it's actually located. So your textbook is showing it as more of a swollen, elongated type feature. Let me deselect it for a second. Let's hide. That's actually the diaphragm that you're seeing there. Sometimes in pictures you don't see that the diaphragm actually has that little strip that runs along the vertebral column and goes a little deeper down into the abdominopelvic cavity. But here you go. Here's your cisterna chyli that we were talking about. You've got that little swollen compartment. And as you can see, if you look there closely, there are lots of lymphatic vessels that are connecting into that compartment. You have lots of lymphatic vessels down here in the abdominopelvic cavity. You don't need to know their names. Just know that you've got a bunch of them in that location. Do be able to identify the cisterna chyli. That's a pretty large structure. And again, it is sitting between your first couple of lumbar vertebrae and the body portions of those vertebrae, and the descending aorta would be in front of this. It's not shown. Visible body has stripped that off so that it's easier to see these lymphatics. Now the cisterna chyli connects to the, let's deselect all, thoracic duct right there. So we said that's going to be the main duct that's collecting fluid from most of the body, from both of your legs and the abdominopelvic cavity, the left side of the chest, your left arm, and the left side of the head. All of that eventually makes its way into the thoracic duct or very close to it. And let me zoom out. Let me strip off some additional tissues here so we can see the thoracic duct a little bit better. Go away. I think I dissected off my thoracic duct. Let me pause for a second. All right, I actually changed views on you here because it's got already has a lot of the tissues stripped off, and it's showing the venous system in here as well. So there's the cisterna chyli again. There's the thoracic duct. So you can see it's running alongside. That's the nice thing about visible body. You can see things better in 3D. So there it is in light blue, running just in front of your vertebral column, goes behind the heart. Comes up all the way to the top of your thoracic vertebrae, so they're not showing the vertebrae above the thoracic ones. If we rotate this around, so he kind of makes this little curve, and keep in mind you've got other lymphatic vessels that are connecting into it. Makes that little curve. And then it winds up, there's actually a little short stump right here that's not shown in this view of visible body. That's actually called the left lymphatic duct. Makes a little curve right there, and then it's going to connect over here into your left subclavian vein. That's where they come together. Okay. Okay, on this view from visible body, notice also the spleen is on here, and it's actually connected to a number of lymph nodes that you can see. They're pretty close to the spleen. The spleen, we'll be talking about it shortly. Its role is to filter the blood, kind of like a big gigantic lymph node, except that it's filtering blood instead of lymph. So it is actually considered to be one of the secondary organs of the lymphatic system because you have a lot of lymphocytes stationed inside the spleen, and it's performing many of the same functions that your lymph nodes do. It's just a very large organ, and it's filtering the blood instead of the lymph. So of course you had to learn how to identify the spleen in Biology 201, so that's not going to be too difficult for you. The other another organ that you need to be able to identify that's part of the lymphatic system is the thymus. Now you had to be able to identify that when we studied the endocrine system. Not shown in this view, but it's positioned up here just on top of the heart. And then I'll also want you to be able to identify your tonsils. And we'll take a look at the tonsils when we actually talk about the tonsils in one of the later video lectures. Okay, and then just keep in mind all those different lymph nodes we saw scattered around. You got about 500 to 600 of them in those various locations in the body. If you cut one of them open, they would more or less have this structure with several different afferent lymphatic vessels bringing in fluid. You have the pink areas, those are sinus spaces in there that the fluid is percolating through. The purple areas that you see are where you have concentrated lymphocytes and macrophages positioned there to intercept all of bacteria and viruses and fungi, or even things like pollen grains, things like that that get into your tissues and trigger allergies. Those types of things are draining in here as well. And then that filtered fluid exits through these efferent vessels, and those are eventually going to lead to the thoracic duct, or if you're over on the right hand side, the right lymphatic duct, and that's going to bring that filtered fluid back into the blood. So that's actually going to conclude this video lecture. On the next one, we're going to talk a little bit about the functions of the spleen.